So just a very quick recap, because the Gemara is going to go through the entire Mishnah. So we have four regarding Tumah. If somebody was Tameh and they ate kachim, or they went to the base of Mikdash, so if they did it on purpose, they get karas. If you did it inadvertently, you bring a carbon, and a very specific carbon called carbon oil yerid. So we have four different scenarios. One is you knew you were tamei, and that's unique regarding tumah, that you had to have a prior knowledge. You had to have a yediyah. So you knew you were tamei, you forgot that you were tamei, and then you remembered you were tamei. For that, you have to bring a carbon, and your kippah doesn't do anything for you. But what happens if you knew you were tamei, you forgot, and you didn't remember yet? So yediyah with no in the beginning, but no yediyah at the end. That we say the seir, the goat that was brought inside, the seir hapnim, alleviates that. What do you mean alleviates? It's toilet, it suspends it, it delays, it prevents from any suffering happening. But they cannot in any way expiate your sin, because the moment you find out, you have to go ahead and bring a carbon. So the seir and nasa b'fnim is for a yediyah in the beginning, but no yediyah at the end. And we learn out from the word pishayim. You did it on purpose. So on purpose, you don't bring a carbon. So right now, you're not high of a carbon, but l'chol chatoisim can lead into a carbon. Then we had the seir hanasa b'chutz. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the seir hanasa b'chutz takes care of a case where you did not have any yediyah in the beginning, but you had a yediyah at the end. And we know that is talking about a case there was a yediyah, because the Torah, the way the Torah puts it together, structures it, the seir that's done on the outside, the korban musaf and outer mizbeach, is similar to the seir that's done on the inner mizbeach. So they both have to do with a tumah where there was knowledge. So the inner one is where there was knowledge in the beginning, and the outer one is where there's no knowledge in the beginning, but you found that afterwards you were tamei. So that you will never be bringing a carbon, because there's no yediyah in the beginning. So that's where the seir nasa b'chutz comes and is mechaper completely atones. Then we say that Yomim Tovim, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, Yomim Tovim and Rosh Chodesh, that both of them atone for a case where there was no yediyah in the beginning and no yediyah at the end. You never knew you were tamei, you never found out you were tamei. So that's the carbon musaf, every Rosh Chodesh, every Yom that takes care of that. That's that. And then we'll have Reb Shimon Yochai, we'll have Reb Meir, when we get to the Gemara discussing those, we'll talk about that. Now the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Shmuel argues with what we just said. Rabbi Shmuel is of the opinion, which we'll learn in a week and a half time, that even if there was no yediyah in the beginning, tumah is no different than any other aveda. If you didn't know this was treif, and you ate it by mistake, and you found out later it was treif, you have to bring a carbon. There's no prerequisite yediyah. So the Rabbi Shmuel holds the same thing applies to tumah. That tumah, even if you don't know, and you found it afterwards, you have to bring a carbon. So according to Rabbi Shmuel, whether you knew the beginning or you just knew at the end, in both cases, they can lead to a carbon. So says the Gemara, and according to Rabbi Shmuel, the Amar, he says, so if you didn't know in prior, but you knew afterwards, bar carbon who you bring a carbon, so seir hanasa b'chutz amay mechaper. In other words, according to Rabbi Shmuel, the seir that was, according to Rabbi Shmuel, the seir that was done in the beginning. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Good. According to Rabbi Shmuel, the seir that was done in the beginning, the seir nasa b'fnim, takes care of both cases of yediyah, whether yediyah was a prerequisite or prior, whether yediyah happened afterwards. In both cases, the seir nasa b'fnim takes care of that. It's toilet. It suspends any suffering. So what is the purpose of the seir hanasa b'chutz? What was that for? Yom Tovim Rosh Chodesh took care of cases we had no knowledge at all, ever. So what was the seir nasa b'chutz for? Says the Gemara, what is it coming to atone? So we answer, the very same thing that the carbon musaf on Yom Chodesh achieves is also accomplished on Yom Kippur, the seir, the carbon musaf done on the outside, in a case where there was no prior or post knowledge. Says the Gemara, But what are you talking about? Isn't that the role of Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov? What's Yom Kippur adding? Says the Gemara, Savaloi holds like Rab Meir. In our Mishnah, Rab Meir was of the view that all the Musafim cover all the possibilities. Okay, that's for sure. That as we'll soon see, that if you had a Yediyah prior, Yediyah after, you have to bring your carbon. Nothing takes care of that. If you had a Yediyah before and no Yediyah after, the Seir Hanasa B'fnim takes care of that. That leaves a Yediyah post and no Yediyah at all. So so according to Rab Meir, both of those are covered by all the Musafim because they all do the same thing. Now, Rabbi Shmuel cannot hold that very same thing because Rabbi Shmuel holds that if there was no Yediyah prior, but there was a Yediyah afterwards, you also would bring a carbon. So Rabbi Shmuel brings that forward to the Seir Hanasa B'fnim. He holds that the inner Seir takes care of whether there was knowledge only in the beginning or there's knowledge only then. That's take care of that. In fact, he holds that the Seir Achutz does only one thing, no Yediyah at all, before or after. But he also holds that all the carbon musafim, Rosh Chodesh, Yom Tov, and Yom Kippur, on this Seir Hanasa, the carbon musaf takes care of that one particular kind of case, which is no Yediyah prior, no Yediyah post. So that all the Seirim, all the Musafim do exactly the same thing, which is al tumas migdash kedosha. They take care of a tumah, and then you walked into the base of migdash, so you ate the carbon. So ebazei lemay hilchasa iskish chitzon leprimi. The pasuk says movad that the carbon, the musaf that you bring on your kippur afternoon is an addition to the one you bring in before. And we learned in the Mishnah that it comes that the outer carbon is similar to the inner carbon. They're both there to take care of tumah. But according to Rabbi Shmuel, that the inner one takes care of any tumah that has to do with Yediyah. What does it add by saying that the carbon musaf on the outside in Mizbeach is comparable to the inner? In what way is it comparable? There was a Yediyah somewhere. Outside there was no Yediyah at all. In what way is it comparable? Comparable. So the Gemara, I'll tell you what. It's just like the Primi only deals with cases of tumah. Forget the ideas part. Only these two. You should know that the outer carbon musaf is not like the seir hamishkaleach, the one that gets thrown off the cliff that takes care of all of the averos a person does. The carbon musaf is only limited to tumah. And how do we know that? Because we compare it to the inner carbon. Now, the type of tumah, whether there was knowledge or not, that's a detail. But that's not the purpose of the comparison between the carbon musaf and the inner. Okay, now the Gemara continues to explain. Al she'ein ba yediyah b'tchila v'lei b'seif. Our Mishnah says no knowledge at all. According to us, which one is taking? Who takes care of that? Because according to us, this ira nasa b'chus, not like a b'shmol, is to take care where there was a knowledge afterwards, idea afterwards. Because that's why we compare it to the inner carbon, the inner seir, that they both have to have a yediyah somewhere. So what does Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh do? They come to mechaper, to atone for where there was never a yediyah at all. Says the Gemara, my time, but Yehuda. How does he know? How does he know that's what it's for? On Makro, it says in Pasuk regarding Rosh Chodesh, Useid izim echad lechatas laHashem, and you have one goat, and is a chatas to Hashem. What kind of expression is chatas Hashem? Every carbon is on the mizbech is for Hashem. Why are you pointing out chatas leHashem? It's a chet, it's a sin. She'ein makeh boy el Hashem. The only one that knows that you committed a sin is Hashem. In other words, you had no prior yediyah, nor did you have a post yediyah that you were tummy when you entered the base of Mikdash, so you ate the carbon. And the Rosh Chodesh carbon will take care of that. Chatas la Hashem. Only Hashem knows about it. Yehei, so you said mechap. Says how can you say that? Behind the boy like Lakish, don't we need this like Lakish? This very pasuk chatas la Hashem is used for another halacha. No, but Lakish said why this carbon it says la Hashem? Hashem said, the famous Gemara in Chulin, in Medrash, that when Hashem created the world, it says in the pasuk he created two luminaries, the sun and the moon. And then later on it says in the pasuk Hamoyer Hakotten, the smaller luminary. What did that happen? So the Gemara that tells us the story that when Hashem created both luminaries, the moon said to the sun, "How can you have two kings identical?" You have two kings with one kesser. So Hashem said, good idea. I'm going to reduce you in size. So the Lechimiyat reduces in size. The moon said, just because I had an idea, therefore I have to be punished. And Hashem made him smaller, and then Hashem asked him for forgiveness, tried to appease him.
We're not supposed to take that literally, are we?
Okay, well, just 1 second. Why not?
Because the moon's a piece of rock and the sun is a completely different chemical thing. It's a piece of hydrogen and helium fusion.
Therefore,
And therefore they can't be equal. They were completely different composition.
you're talking about equal in composition. We're talking about two things. We're talking about equal in the source of light and how much light they emanated. At that time, the night would have been just as bright as the day. And who said it was then initially it was not gases as well? And maybe that was a punishment. He reduced in size and turned them into rock. You have no problem Hashem
I mean, do you
creating a
want me to
world.
take that literally?
It's amazing. You have no problem Hashem creating a world from nothing, but you have a problem how Hashem changes the moon from one thing to another thing.
Well, scientifically, it's easier. Particles can be created from nothing to go into and out of existence. But
No, you already have to
scientifically, that makes
you
no
have to
sense.
always start with something. Part of any added, you have to start always with something.
What do
There's
you
no
mean?
such thing as spontaneous thing in our science, and they always have to start with something. But Hashem created the world from there's nothing here,
Yeah,
no
well,
atoms,
science
no
actually
cells.
agrees with Yoshmi Ayin.
Well, no, they don't. There's always go back to them, always something to start with, always something. Doesn't matter if it's a different
We can have a
composition.
whole particle physics discussion here, but there are particles which come into and out of existence.
From where?
It's been shown that if you go to a particle accelerator, there's protons and they break up into pieces, and they've been shown there are particles that actually don't exist that come in and out of existence. It's a Yoshmi ion type situation. It actually happens.
But you still have to work with something to get that. Don't do anything and see where which particles come into existence. That doesn't happen. You
Yes, it
always
does.
have to have a catalyst.
Okay, well, we can argue particle physics if you
Okay.
want.
Bottom line is getting back to here.
Well, you want me to? So the only question I'm asking is, can I take this that story like a midrash, or do I have to take it literally?
It's Gemara and Chulin, as we'll get to one. I think that Samach. We'll get there. We'll see. But why can't you? I don't understand why you have a problem taking it literally. If you this is during creation, Hashem is creating the world. Nothing was there, he making, and then he changed something, or this is always the plan. So let me just finish what the Gemara says there. So Hashem tried to appease him and said, "Oh, the Yidden will bring karbanas." Wasn't appeased. Hashem said that Yom Tovim will be based on the Rosh Chodesh, so you'll always be involved in the Jewish lives. He wasn't appeased because he said that you also have to do with seasons, which is the sun. Sun also gets credit.
But
Then
I
Hashem
mean,
said that
the
all the
sun's
great
talking and the moon's talking, and they're talking to Hashem, and you want me to take that literally?
you think that we have that Hashem has to talk and hear your voices. What are you trying to say?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that we get a I mean, we get a story in the Gemara, right? And you've got anthropomorphisms and all sorts of stuff going on. But does it mean we have to take that? I mean, how can it be possibly be literal? It doesn't make any sense literally.
Literally, it means like the one Chulin says that every blade of grass has a malach or a mazel that tells it to grow, and that malach is the one who's doing all the communication. Let's put it that
Okay,
way.
so well, I don't really understand what that means exactly.
Okay, so when you grow up, you'll understand.
Uh,
But
well, I'm never going to grow up according to my wife.
remember, this is being recorded for longevity. So
Yeah, well. For longevity, okay.
okay, let's continue.
Let it
Then
go. Let it
so
go.
then Hashem said to the moon, "I'll tell you what, bring a chattas for me." Now the Rif, which is one of the first poskim, the Rif is one of the first poskim. Only what he did was he did halachas. He took out of the Gemara all the halachas, he put them together. But from some odd reason, on this very Gemara here, the Rif actually quotes the whole story of the Gemara Chulin and gives his explanation as to what actually happened here, which means that the Rif had people like you asking all kinds of questions, so he felt he has to say something.
What do you
Taisus,
mean by
the
people
name,
like me?
I mean, who had questions, not like you, people who had questions. And Taisus here brings the name of the Aruch, which is very similar to the Rif. Not that they brought a carbon chatzas for Hashem, that Hashem did anything wrong. probably the plan all along. What it means is that I am going to nominate this particular day, that this is a time when people can bring achatas to atone for other sins, and that shows you how special you are. They're bringing chatas for their sins to me, not that the Eibush sinned, for their sins, but we chose the day of Rosh Chodesh to bring it for me, these chatos, and that shows you how special you are. But the Rambam Nevuchim says that Rosh Chodesh was a time when the Egyptians would celebrate and they would worship their gods. So when the Eibush is saying to the moon that Yom Tovim, it's obvious it's a religious thing, because why middle of the month or whatever, you go ahead and celebrate. But as Chodesh, you can interpret it that this is some form of Egyptian worship. And so therefore he's saying, Chatas la Hashem, we're going to do a Chatas, not a thanks offering, or that we do a Chatas, a Karma Chatas, and everyone realize that Rosh Chodesh, what's Rosh Chodesh all about? It's actually about a day that Hashem nominated, and not because we Chas v'Sholom we're trying to replicate the Egyptians and how they served their gods. Anyway, the Gemara continues here, Daf Tes in the first white line. So don't we need the Chatas Lashem to teach us not that what do you call it? That it's dealing with a case of tumah where no one knows, not you. You don't know. You have no prior knowledge, no post knowledge. Only Hashem knows. But rather, we use Chatas Lashem because of the story about the moon. Why is it Hashem? Olai. See, it depends on the girsa. Rashi's version is olai, which means you take it literally. Hashem is bringing a chatas for himself for humiliating or insulting the moon. That he reduced the size of the moon. The Medrash says that Hashem appeased the moon by saying, "Look, I'm giving all these stars, all these, which the sun doesn't have." But he was never appeased until Hashem said this. Imkain, so we have the Rif, and then we have the Rambam, and then we have Rashi. Imkain, if so, Lema Kra al Hashem. If it's only to teach us Reish Lakish thing, then that you chatas for Hashem, but should have said you bring a chatas al Hashem, for Hashem. My la Hashem, to Hashem. Likadamra, therefore we let out to Hashem, because only Hashem knows that you committed a sin. So the Gemara asks, if so, maybe that's the only thing that Chatas Hashem is here to teach you, that it's mechaper, it atones for those people who were tummy, had no prior post knowledge. How does Reish Lakish know to learn from here also about this Chatas for Yerech? Im keinei makro, let the pasuk say Chatas Hashem. Let the pasuk say Chatas to Hashem. My Lashem. Why does it say Hashem? Because it's Chatas Hashem. By saying La Hashem, to Hashem, as if it's for Hashem. So therefore you learn two things. So I'm going to So we're going to ask a very simple question. Since it says Chatas La Hashem, it's a Chatas that only Hashem knows you committed a sin. So why limit it only to cases of Tumah? You forgot, you didn't know you were Tumah. Why don't we limit to any Avera you did? You never found out, you ate something treif, you had no idea it was treif, and you never found out afterwards. And maybe that's what the Korban Chodesh comes to atone for. All of babes. How you know to limit it only to Tumah? Says the Gemara, this is where the Yeshiva Rabbi Shmuel came along. Tana, the very Rabbi Shmuel, Yeshiva Shmuel lived in the Brisa, and this is how we know. Hoyil v'zeh is man kavur. Rosh Chodesh has a fixed time. Every month, the beginning of the month is Rosh Chodesh. V'zeh is man kavur. All the averas that a person does, whenever you did the avera, you got to bring the korban chatas. There's no fixed time to bring the chatas. You bring it as soon as you know that you did an avera. But when, in fact, we have a concept about the achin, a delay. But when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, every Rosh Chodesh you bring a korban chatas. It's a fixed time. And where else do you find that? Yom Kippur. Every Yom Kippur you bring a korban chatas. So just like a Yom Kippur is there, then we know, we learned before, where it says metumasai, we had the two opinions in the Gemara we had the last few days. How do you know that's only talking about Tumah? So because Yom Kippur is only there, this era nas b'fnim, and say not regarding matters of tumah, not like the seir they throw off a cliff, the simmer shaleh, but that covers everything. All I say, loishasa, kalas, chamuras. So this is only limited tumah. So the same thing, Yom Tovim is only also only tumah. Avzei no chaper al tumah mikdash kedoshim. So the is the same thing. Says the Gemara, okay. So you explained to me Ashkechan Se'idi Rosh Chadash. So now you explain to me how I know that Rosh Chodesh, the Karban Musaf, is there to be mechaper on tumah, a tumah that you had no idea. You said that Yom Tov does exactly the same thing. How do you know that? I know what's to come to mechaper. If you're gonna try to answer me the same answer you just gave me Rosh Chodesh. That what that what Yom Tov is a fixed time every month, the 15th day of the month, or whatever the Shavuos is, the sixth day of the month. Every Yom Tov has a fixed time, and Yom Kippur has a fixed time. The same calculation Rabbi Shmuel made regarding Rosh Chodesh, but equal mifrich. Remember that tumah is a very strict, a very severe avera, because if you did it deliberately, you get karas. It's only if you did it inadvertently, we're lenient, and we say not only you bring karachatas, but it's oil the yara. It's commensurate to your economic status. But otherwise, you get karas. So it's a very severe avera. So I can say like this: where you want to learn Yom Tov for the fact that it's a fixed time. Now we have other two musafim that's fixed. We have Karban Rosh Chodesh and we have Karban Yom Kippur. Where do you want to draw a parallel from? Let's start with Rosh Chodesh. Even Rosh Chodesh, you want to say, well, Rosh Chodesh is fixed and the Karban Musaf there atones for Tumah. I'll argue she can't touch it because it's so regularly every single month. Therefore, it has the capacity to mechaper on something as severe as Tumah. But the Yom Tov is only 3 times a year. Who says that's what it's coming here for? Number one. And even the Yom Kippurim, and if you're going to say let's draw a parallel for Yom Kippur, it's a fixed time and that's for Tumah, I'll argue Shekhem Merubah Kaparasa. Yom Kippur is a day generally that atones for all the sins between the Seira Mishtaleach and everything else. Therefore, it has the capacity to atone for a sin that you get karas for. But Yom Tov does not have the capacity. Maybe Yom Tov alleviates or atones for lesser sins, but not something as severe as Tumah, where if you did it deliberately and entered the base of Mikdash, you'll chayiv karas. And if you want to say, you're going to say to me, that is an argument. Because what was my counter argument? My counter argument was that Yom Kippur has so many kaparas, meruba kaparasai, and therefore you can't compare it to it. So you'll come back to me and say, hey, that's not an argument. What about Rosh Chodesh? We learn Rosh Chodesh from Yom Kippur, even though Yom Kippur, you can argue, is meruba kaparasa. Yom Kippur is very special. That's why you can atone for tumah. How do you know Rosh Chodesh? We didn't raise that question, that objection. So maybe the same thing here, the same token, you cannot raise that objection when it comes to learning Yom Tov from Yom Kippur. Says the Gemara, that's what you might say. What kind of question am I asking? We don't object. I'll tell you why. Hasam, very interesting. Hasam kapara michtav ksiva. Over there, the Torah clearly says when it comes to the Chodesh that it's there for a kapara, right? It's there for to atone. Now, if it wouldn't have said anything else, we'll learn that way. Rational is a little different. If it wouldn't have said anything else, we would think. So, what's Rosh Chodesh mechaper? All averos, any avera. Then we look at Yom Kippur. Over there, also it's a kapara, the Kar Musaf. But what is it mechaper? Only Tumas Migdash Kedashim. So what's Yom Kippur doing? It's not coming to tell us that Rosh Chodesh can be mechaper. That the pasuk says. What Yom Kippur is doing is limiting, is defining what is mechaper. Only Tumah. If Yom Kippur, which is such a high madrega, can only be mechaper on Tumah and matters of Tumah, so Rosh Chodesh also only matters of Tumah. So therefore, Yom Kippur is not teaching anything new on Rosh Chodesh. It's on the contrary, coming to limit what Rosh Chodesh can do. Hasam kapara michtav. Over there it says lechatas lashem. It's a kapara. Is gilui milsa ba'almo. So what's Yom Kippur coming to do? It's coming just to reveal to us that it's not mechaper all avedas, only those that deal with tumah. Avol hacha, but over here, when it comes to Yom Tov, to learn that it's mechaper, the idea of tumah. Who said maybe Yom Kippur can be mechaper tumah because Yom Kippur is meruba kaparasa, so even tumah which is involved with chorus, Yom Kippur can atone. But on Yom Tov, who said it can atone it? Rosh Chodesh, we know if the pasuk says clearly it's a chatas l'Hashem that it covers all sins. So Yom Kippur comes to limit it. That you can learn from Yom Kippur. But when it comes to Yom Tov, we don't know what's mechaper. You want to say, oh, let it be mechaper tumah. Who said tumah is chorus? Maybe Yom Tov can't do that. Ella, so Gemara says, I'll tell you how we know. You know how we know that Yom Tov has the capacity to mechaper for tumah? We'll see in the next blot. Rab Chama Bar Chanina said, it could have said seirizim. Instead, it says usir. There's a vav. A vav is a conjunctional letter, which means it adds. In addition. So therefore, as we'll see later what Abraham is referring to over there, so is hachinami here too, seir v'seir. It could have said seir, and it says instead v'seir with an extra vav to tell you that what? That we're comparing and the goat by Yom Tov. What do you mean and? Whatever Rosh Chodesh does, and also Yom Tov does the same thing. It's the and that teaches that Yom Tov can be mechaper on Tumah. And how do you know Rosh Chodesh can be mechaper on Tumah? Because we made a binyan av. We compared it to Yom Kippur. And something you learn from a binyan av, you can then go ahead and teach something else through a hekesh. And in a lot of places they discuss this whole idea of Rashi because the Gemara's Vachim has all of these questions that if the only way you know B is learning it from A, and now you want to learn C from it, can you learn 2 steps away? But Rashi seems to be saying clearly that you can. Okay, so the Gemara continues. Now, this Ishke, the Gemara continues. Ishke Sidra goes to the Chodesh. So we compare the Musaf of Yom Tov to the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. Masa Ide Rosh Chodesh Einon Mechap. And what do we know about Rosh Chodesh? The only thing that it's mechaper is al she'ein bo yediyah loy b'tchila b'seif. Right? There's no knowledge whatsoever. That's the only thing as we learned before. That's what Rosh Chodesh does. Chatas la Hashem. Only Hashem knows about it. Is af se'idei regalim. It's the same thing when it comes to the korban musaf on Yom Tov. Einon mechaper ela she'ein bo yediyah loy b'tchila b'seif. Only on those kind of tumas where there was no yediyah at all. Okay, now the Gemara continues on this very point. So, interesting question. You're telling me that Yom Tov Rosh Chodesh is only mechaper if there's no knowledge at all. What happens at this point, at this juncture, there's no knowledge, but there is someone who saw you, and they know that you became tamei, and they saw you enter the base of English. So one day they might catch up with you, a chance encounter, and they'll tell you. So there's a strong potential that one day you will find out. How do we treat that? Because you can argue, when we say you have no knowledge, is that nobody knows that you became tamei. You had no knowledge before, you had no knowledge after. There's no way in the world you'll ever find out. So that's what Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov mechaper. But if there's a potential that one day you'll have yediyah, maybe it's only Yom Kippur that's mechaper you. Maybe that's treated, even though right now you don't know, it's treated as if there will be a yediyah at the end, and therefore only Yom Kippur mechaper, not Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov, or not. Says the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda said, "Al she'ein bo yediyah," there's no knowledge at all. Hani mila bechet she'ein sofer levada. It's only perhaps only when you did, let's say, a sin discreetly, privately, no one else saw. There's no chance in the world you'll ever find out. But a sin that you committed, that one day you might find out. In other words, there are people out there who saw and they can reveal it to you. Is kimishi yeshi he will treat as if you will have knowledge as if you did, and therefore it's only the korban musaf Yom Kippur that takes care of it, and not the Rosh Chodesh and not Yom Tov. So you got to wait 12 months till next time. Then Yom Kippur. Even though there's a good chance you'll find out eventually. Right now you're totally not unaware. Hashem can be still called that at this stage, Hashem is the only one who's aware. Toshma, so the Gemara answers, I'll quote you a brisa where completely, definitively spells out the following. The Tanya of the brisa. If you have no knowledge, not in the beginning, not at the end, the chet, or a sin, that one day you will find out, but right now you have no idea, not prior, not post, is se'idi haragolim, Rosh Chodesh mechaprim. Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov will atone for it, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Then the Gemara continues, Rab Shimon Omer. Now, remember, Rab Shimon disagrees. He says that Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh are not atoning for the same kind of tumah. He says that Yom Tov is atoning for tumah where there was no yediyah in the beginning and no yediyah at the end. But Rosh Chodesh is something else altogether. You know what Rosh Chodesh is? Rosh Chodesh is that you were not tamei, you were tar, but inadvertently you ate a korban that turned out to be tamei. You had no idea, and you ate from a korban, a tar she'achal kodesh, that's tamei. That's what Rosh Chodesh is coming to forgive. So he separates the two. And the question is, how does he know? We already explained how we know that Yom Rosh Chodesh is where there's no yediyah because chatzos l'Hashem. How does he know differently? Says the Gemara, Rav Shimon said, "Golim mechaper navel asirish chaydish. Golim is mechaper take for no idea, but a chaydish is talking about a person who is toyed. Omer Rabbi Lazar, Omer Rabbi Yishia, my time Rav Shimon. Where does he learn it from? He said the following: Omer Kro, when Moshe Rabbeinu rebuked Aaron because after the story in Shmini, after the story of Nadav Avihu passing away, he brought three kabbanas on that day. One was the carbon of Nachshon and Aminadav, and one was the carbon of Maluyim, and one was the Rosh Chodesh carbon because it happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And that was they brought three sedim, three goats, and the one from Rosh Chodesh that didn't eat. It didn't. And Moshe Rabbeinu was really incensed by why they didn't eat it, and he asked them what happened. Did they take it outside or something? So the pasuk says there, "Va'oisa nasalachem." It said, "I gave this to you, which is the seir of Rosh Chodesh, losses to carry as avoin ha'eda, the sin, the iniquities of the congregation of the Eden." So it says clearly here that what's the purpose of this? To carry the avoin ha'eda. The high cro beside the We're talking about which goat did they toss out? They didn't eat? Is it a Chodesh one? Now, so how do we know it's talking about a case of a person who's tired? Because we make a gzera shava. The yalif, the word oven that's written here, and the word oven that's written by a tzitz. So the Kohen Gadol wore this plate around his head. It's called a tzitz. The role of the tzitz was to atone if a carbon became tameh. The carbon became tummy. The tzitz was mechaper on this carbon that the person who brought it, without realizing he brought it, that person does not have to replace the carbon, does not have to bring another one because he was atoned. So the word ovain by a tzitz deals with a person who was tired, but the animal became tummy. So when it says ovain by Rosh Chodesh, we're dealing with a similar case. The person is tired, but the Kodesh was tummy. And Rosh Chodesh comes to mechaper in that. So he learns from this very Shama. Nema kan oven says we sit. Benema lahalan oven. It says by tzitzin ma lahalan tumas basa. What do we know by the tzitz? The tzitz is the case where not the person is tummy because that's irrelevant. We're talking about that the part that should go to go to Hashem, the blood that has to be sprinkled, the fats of and the limbs that have to go on the mizbeach, or by carbon oil, the entire animal that has to go on the bed. Anything that belongs to Hashem goes to Hashem, and it became tummy. And the tzitz, and you brought it up, the tzitz will atone for it. And we had a machlekes, we had a Gemara Sanhedrin, whether it's hutra or duchuya, but regardless, that's what the tzitz's role is, to deal with an animal that is tummy. Is afkan, so to Rosh Chodesh. What are we talking about? Where the animal was tummy and the person was tired. Is towards basar, talking about the animal is tummy, the person is tired, and that's what Rosh Chodesh is coming to talk. That's Rabbi Shimon Yochai. There's the Gemara. 1 second. What exactly does the tzitz do? The tzitz, what it does is that the carbon brought on the mizbeach is good enough, but that's it. It's not being mechaper a person who ate it. So if you want to compare to the tzitz, we'll say that it's not being mechaper on a sin. All it does is it enables you to that if you brought it on the mizbeach, okay, you don't have to bring a substitute. You don't have to bring another one. So Hari Rosh Chodesh is actually atoning, is being mechaper for a person who ate Tamid Kamit. So the Gemara Afkan Oilin, the one answers, Avoin Ha'edaksi. What does the Pasuk say about Rosh Chodesh? It says that Moshe Rabbeinu said that I gave you this carbon was meant losses es avoin eder, to carry the sin of the community. The sin is eating a Talmudic carbon. So and says clearly that's what Rosh Chodesh is for. Losses es avoin eder comes to forgive that. That's how we know Rosh Chodesh is forgive a Torah who ate Kodesh of Tamei. Says the Gemara, okay, Mechner asks a question. Migmer Gomri Mahadodi, now that you have the Gzera Shava of an oven to learn from each other. So why don't you say that they're both Mechaper, both things? Why don't we say that Rosh Chodesh, as well, and the tzitz will ask for each one, that they do two things. They Mechaper the person of Torah who ate from the tummy, and it allows you, enables you to bring the carbon on the Mizbech. Is the chaper the Rosh Chodesh adidei. So why do we say Rosh Chodesh atones whatever it's meant to atone? Yeah, avoid ha'eda. If they ate a Torah, they ate tamid. And by the tzitz, it also takes care of the matter that tzitz takes care of. You can ask a simple question. If you have a tzitz, what is it going to add if the carbon Rosh Chodesh, you have a tzitz right there? The Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz the whole time. What happened for whatever reason? There's no tzitz, it broke. So that moment, the Rosh Chodesh will take care of it. Now, the tzitz broke. On Makros, Gemara says, I'll tell you how I know that Rosh Chodesh can only do one task, and not two. Avon. It says in the passing in singular that the Rosh Chodesh's losses is Avoin Ha'eda, one sin. Avon Echad Noisa. They Noisa Beis Avoin. You can only deal with one sin and not two. Can't deal with two matters. There's one matter, you're Torah, a Tame, take care of that, but not going to take care of the animal, which is Tame. Okay, so you have a special posse for that. What about the other way around? What about tzitz? It says you have a gzei shava. A gzei shava is all in. So the nechapa tzitz adidei b'ad l'chaydish. So why do you say the tzitz now? The tzitz, on the one hand, allows the carbon to be brought on the back, but also it atones the person. You know, but why wait till next chaydish? The tzitz will constantly atone the person who ate tummy by mistake. And nafkamina, what do we need the tzitz for? L'tumah de'ila bezelazah. If on the 15th day of the month you ate tummy, you have to wait the next chodesh to be forgiven. But instead, as soon as, and according to Rab Zayda, for example, if you die, where's your kapara? So the tzitz will take care of that. On Makro, it says in Pasik, Oisa, regarding the chodesh, it says something else. Not only does it say Avoina Eida, it says Oisa, as if to say only this carbon is here to this carbon is here to take care of this particular matter, a tired eating for a tummy, but nothing else can take care of that. So Oisa is limiting that only this is the carbon that was designated to deal with that matter. Oisa to Noisa oven, nothing else can. The Rashi comes along and says, "See, it says clearly. I don't have to make the whole pulpul. He says it says here avon ha'eda. There's an extra hey. Instead of saying avon eda, it says avon ha'eda to tell you that the only thing it deals with is the sin that a person does, a Torah eating tummy. And by tzitz it says the avon ha'eda eda. The like kachim doesn't deal with animal. But hasik even by the tzitz it says avon ha'kachim. There's an extra hey there that the only sin that it deals with is the animal itself. If you know, it's brought on his back, not regarding the person if he consumed it. Veloy Edo, Kachim Veloy Edo, not the other people. Says the Gemara, okay, so Ashkan, according to Shemichai, he separates Yom Tov from Shchedesh. So we now know how he knows that Shchedesh is here to deal with a Toy who ate Tameh. But how does he know that Yom Tov is here to deal with Noyidi in the beginning, Noyidi in the end? Where does he learn that from? So the Gemara Ashkan see there's Chodashim, Chapel Toshach Tameh. So we see there's Chodesh is dealing with a party person. Obviously, the Golim. But what about Yom Tov? The Mechapel Hashem If you tell me Yom Tov comes to deal with a person who has no idea in the beginning or the end, Minolan, how do you know that? The Gemara Kida Amar Rab Chama Rab Chanina. Like Rab Chama Rab Chanina said, this is what we mentioned before. It could have said by Yom Tov also Seir, a goat. Instead, it says usir and because it says and is hachinam mesiv. Just like the Chodesh, it says and. So over here too, it says and by Yom Tov. So we say that that it takes care of just like Yom Kippur, and also Yom Tov also will deal with tumatara, and therefore it goes like this. The Iskish, so that's how we start. Start and. The Iskish, we compare, we equate the carbon of Yom Tov to the carbon of Rosh Chodesh. Because right now we don't know yet what the Yom Tov is actually dealing with. It may be different Averis. It's a kapara, but for what? So first we say and we compare it. We say and it's Rosh Chodesh and. So we're adding to Rosh Chodesh, and we're saying Ma Seir Rosh Chodesh, just like that's Ir Rosh Chodesh. The Milsa the Kodesh Mechaper deals with carbon that was tamei. Okay, the details whether the person was Torah or the animal was tamei, that's not important. It's the idea of tumah is actually to go and milsa the kodesh mechaper. So Yom Tov also is coming to tell you what to deal with tumah, because in the psukim we're talking about all the kabbalas. The first thing is a shchedesh. The next one says Yom Tov says u seir. So therefore Yom Tov is following up for a shchedesh. It's doing with tumah. Now let's analyze which case of tumah is dealing with. So let us say, maybe Yom Tov does the same thing as a Chodesh. A Tahir person ate a Talmudic carbon. How do you know that Yom Tov is dealing with a whole different case where you were Tameh, just you were not aware prior or post? How do we know that? Maybe it's dealing with the same thing as Chodesh because it says and. So we already said before, harmony, we said, Oisa. Oisa noisa oven vein achanes oven. By Rosh Chodesh it says that this oisa, that this particular carbon Rosh Chodesh is the only carbon that is designated to deal with that issue of a tire eating a carbon that's tummy. So therefore, we can't use that. It must be talking about the animal itself as tummy. So now there's a number of scenarios. Let's go through which one is Yom Tov here to mechaper. Maybe Yom Tov is mechaper the same thing Yom Kippur is mechaper. And we already said in the very pasuk it says twice achas b'shana. It says the pasuk that Aaron HaKohen will forgive, on the corners of the mizbeach or sprinkle the mizbeach. It says achas b'shana once a year from the Chatzal Kippurim, and then it says again achas b'shana yichapel. It says twice achas b'shana. So we darshan achas b'shana once a year. Kapara zu loiter achas b'shana. We darshan that this kapara that Yom Kippur does is only once a year. So Yom Tov can't be doing the same thing. So what's left? What can Yom Tov then be mechaper? In other words, whatever Yom Kippur did, the inner carbon, which is the idea in the beginning, or the outer carbon, which is the idea of and before we learned that we compare the chitzon to the pnimi, we compare the outer carbon to the inner carbon, and just like the inner carbon, because it says milvad, in addition to the first carbon, so just like the inner carbon, it's a one-off once a year, so to the outer carbon once a year. So whether there's a D in the beginning, which is the inner carbon, or whether there's a D at the end, which is the outer carbon, that can't be dealt with on Yom Tov. So what's left for Yom Tov? And if you tell me what's left, there's two possible scenarios. He knew before, he knew afterwards. Yom Kippur doesn't help it. You got to bring a carbon. How about carbon? And we know that we're learning Gemara Krisis that even though you went through your Kippur, as soon as you did an Aveda, you ate tray for fats, you have to go bring a carbon. The Kippur cannot in any way remove that obligation. So it can't be talking about that. What's left? If you can tell me he had knowledge prior, but he didn't have knowledge after. No, isn't that Yom Kippur? The Yom Kippur, that's the Yom Kippur. That the Yom Kippur. If you had knowledge prior and then you weren't aware afterwards, so obviously you cannot bring a carbon. We mentioned last time, was showing him why don't you bring a carbon if you didn't know afterwards? Is it just practically really a chayiv a carbon, but you just don't know to bring it? Or the pshat is that the trigger to be chayiv you a carbon is the knowledge afterwards. And kolzman you don't know, you're actually not even chayiv a carbon. But because it could come to a carbon, therefore that's taken care of by the seir and nasa b'fnim. And that's only once a year. If you tell me the case we had no idea prior, but idea afterwards, right? So that's the seir and nasa b'chutz, high seir nasa b'chutz. And we just said we compare the outside to the inside only once a year. The Yom Kippur Chaper. Al Korchos, therefore we have no choice. There's only one possible scenario that Yom Tov deals with. You have no prior knowledge and no post knowledge. Okay, we'll stop here.
Can I ask? Thanks. Getting back to basics.
Yeah.
Grammatically, it wouldn't work if you took the vav away from Vesair, because it says in the Torah, like in the Musaf davening, Umin chasam b'niskeim kimudubar, shlosh esranim lapar, ushnei esranim la'ayel, v'isra nakeves v'yain kiniske Vesair l'chaper. Why do they suddenly say you don't need a vav there?
Because in English grammar, we would have learned that you never begin a sentence with and by Yom Tov, and by the Chodesh, and Yom Tov, whatever it is, some of those psukim actually is the beginning of a pasuk. And so and even if it's in the middle, we're saying it could have still been, because the beginning of the pasuk, it should have said seir without a vav. And it says and. So therefore, it's coming to teach you some kind of halacha. This is a continuation of whatever was before. And the sequence of the kabbanas there in the parsha, and we'll see tomorrow, some of them, it doesn't say and we actually going to have a problem with it. It's okay, all the ands, a lot of ands, but Shavuos has no and Yom Kippur has no and. So, and we're going to see tomorrow that's going to cause a problem. But it's only the ands.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Is it only the Kohen Gadol who do the Chodesh Kabbanos?
No. Any Kohen can do it.
So if the Kohen Hedjed did it, there's no tzitz in the Mikdash.
No, the Kohen Gadol was still there, present. He doesn't have to be involved in that, but he's there.
Okay.
Called many ways it sits. But it seems from the Gemara, it seems that it sits sometimes was fragile and broke, and it didn't have it sits for a while. I don't know how long the repairs took, but it's possible. But the sits is always there.
Okay.
Okay.